The man had chosen the house because of the creek. It was not wide or deep, just a gentle stream that curled along the edge of his backyard. The sound of running water filled the air with peace, and in the mornings when the sun broke through the trees, the light danced on the surface like silver ribbons. He would sit on his porch with a cup of coffee and listen, feeling the stress of years slowly wash away. For him the creek was not just water, it was life, a quiet gift of nature that made the home feel complete. He could already picture summer evenings with friends by the water, autumn leaves floating past, and winter mornings when frost touched the banks like lace. But while he saw beauty, someone else saw only trouble. Her name was Karen, the HOA president. Her house sat 2 doors down, and from the first moment she laid eyes on him she had decided he would not be easy to control. She stood at her window often, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, watching him as he cleared weeds and placed chairs by the water. She told herself the creek was ugly, a threat to the property values. She whispered to her board members that it was dangerous, that it made the community look messy. But deep inside it was not about the creek, it was about power. Because Karen believed nothing should exist in the neighborhood without her permission. And the creek flowed too freely for her liking. The man noticed her stares but ignored them. He had dealt with people like her before. People who thought rules gave them ownership of other lives. Still he was polite, waving when she passed, nodding when she forced a smile. He kept his words short, not giving her fuel. Neighbors whispered about Karen too. Some warned him that she liked to make problems where none existed. Others simply shook their heads when her name was mentioned. But no one dared stand against her. She had fined people for the color of their curtains, for planting the wrong flowers, even for leaving holiday lights up a day too long. She thrived on fear, and fear kept the streets silent. The man understood quickly that the creek would become her weapon. One afternoon she marched over with a clipboard in hand. Her smile stretched but her eyes sharp. She said the creek was unsightly, that it bred mosquitoes, that it threatened the safety of children. The man listened calmly and replied that the creek had been flowing for decades before either of them moved here, and that it was clean, safe, and part of the land. Karen frowned, scribbling on her clipboard. She warned that the HOA had the right to demand changes. He asked softly if that rule was written in the bylaws. She stuttered, then claimed she would check. She left with a stiff walk, muttering that the board would discuss it. That night she called an emergency meeting. Board members gathered in her living room. She spoke in fiery tones about the new resident and his dangerous creek. She painted pictures of floods, of property damage, of disease. Her board nodded, some out of belief, most out of fear of crossing her. She declared that the creek must go, that she would handle it herself if necessary. Meanwhile the man sat by the water, listening to the steady stream under the moonlight. He thought of how quickly peace could become a battlefield when control was threatened. He wondered how far Karen would go. The frogs croaked softly, the crickets sang. The creek did not care about HOA rules. It had been there long before and would be there long after. But he knew Karen was not a woman who let go. She was plotting, waiting, and the first battle was already at his door. He finished his coffee, stood, and looked toward the dark windows of her house. He could almost feel her eyes on him even now, narrow, watching, already planning her next move. The creek whispered on, calm but unbroken. And he knew that soon its calmness would clash with her fury, and the sound of water might be joined by the sound of war. The next morning the man stepped outside with his coffee, the air still cool, the creek running smooth at the edge of his yard. He wanted to enjoy a quiet start, but he noticed a slip of paper tucked under his door, neat and official looking. When he opened it his jaw tightened slightly. It was a violation notice, the very first one since he had moved in. Bold letters claimed the creek was a hazard, that it disturbed the harmony of the neighborhood, and that corrective action must be taken immediately. He read it twice, calm as ever, then set it on the table inside without a word. Later that afternoon Karen herself appeared, walking fast down the street with her clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her smile wide but her eyes hard. She waved to the neighbors watching from behind curtains before planting herself at his doorstep. She said she was here to follow up on the notice, her tone sugary but sharp. She explained that the creek had already been marked for removal by the board, that it was only a matter of time before action was taken. The man listened without interrupting, then asked again, as he had before, if this so-called rule was written in the bylaws. Karen's face twitched. She avoided his gaze for a second, then laughed a little too loudly and said the board's word was as good as law. The husband simply shook his head and said rules not written down were not rules at all. She narrowed her eyes and scribbled something furious on her clipboard. Neighbors nearby whispered. One old man shook his head slowly. Another woman turned away quickly, afraid to be seen watching. Karen spoke louder now, raising her voice so everyone could hear. She accused him of refusing to cooperate. She warned him that the HOA had the power to fine him daily until he obeyed. She said if he ignored her, the matter would escalate to legal action. The man stayed calm. He told her he was not refusing anything, he was simply asking for proof. Proof that she had yet to show. His wife came out then. Standing quietly by his side, her presence steady, Karen's eyes flicked toward her with disdain. She muttered that outsiders never lasted here, that the board always got its way. Then she turned sharply on her heel and stormed back down the street, calling over her shoulder that this was just the beginning. The couple went back inside, placing the violation notice on the growing stack of papers they had already started to keep. That evening neighbors whispered more openly. A few came close enough to speak. One warned that Karen had ruined others before. Another whispered that they admired how calm the man had stayed. But most slipped away quickly, too scared to linger. The sun set and the creek glowed silver under the moon. The man sat by it again, sipping tea now, watching the water flow freely. But in his mind he could hear Karen's voice, sharp and full of false power. He knew she would not stop, she would dig deeper, push harder. And the creek that gave him peace had become the weapon she would use to test his patience. He leaned back in his chair and listened to the water, telling himself that patience was strength, that truth was slow but heavy, and though Karen believed she was building a case against him, what she was really building was the rope that would tighten around her own neck, drop by drop, page by page, lie by lie. The night was still, the creek kept running, and somewhere in the dark Karen was already plotting her next move, unaware that every step she took would only lead her closer to her own downfall. That night the man sat on his porch with the soft sound of the creek flowing steady through the dark. The moonlight shone on the water like a silver path. He breathed slowly, calm as always, but he could feel something in the air, a restlessness that did not belong to the wind or the night. It belonged to Karen. For days she had pushed with threats and papers, and now she was ready to act. Just past midnight the man heard the rumble of engines on the street, not one but several. He stood slowly and looked through the shadows. Headlights flashed against the trees, and 3 trucks rolled up to the edge of his yard. Men in hard hats stepped out, their voices low, carrying hoses and bags of cement. Karen followed in her dark sedan, stepping out with a grin that glowed even in the night. She waved her clipboard like a sword, telling the men to hurry, telling them the creek was to be sealed. The man did not move. He stood still on his porch watching. His wife came beside him, her face calm, her eyes sharp. The workers began dragging hoses toward the water. Machines roared to life. The smell of cement filled the air. Karen strutted back and forth, muttering about how this nuisance would finally be gone, how the community would thank her. Neighbors peeked through curtains again, some whispering in shock, some pulling out phones to record, but no one dared step outside. The man finally spoke. His voice low but clear. He told Karen that blocking a natural water flow was dangerous, that it would not stop the water, it would only push it somewhere else. Karen laughed loudly, her voice echoing against the houses. She mocked him for being dramatic. She told the workers to keep pouring. They obeyed. The hoses hissed and thick gray cement spilled into the creek, covering rocks, drowning the soft sound of water. The man clenched his jaw but did not shout. His wife touched his arm and whispered. Patience. Her calmness steadied him. He simply stood there recording everything with his phone. Karen noticed and snapped at him, warning that recording HOA projects was against the rules. He raised his eyebrows and said softly, "Rules that are not written are nothing." Her face twisted with anger. She turned away and barked at the workers to pour faster. The creek groaned under the weight of cement. Its flow blocked. The water struggled to find space, already pooling at the edges of the yard. The man whispered that nature cannot be trapped forever, that water always remembers where to go. Karen ignored him. She strutted back to her car, shouting loud enough for the street to hear that the problem was solved, that the creek would trouble no one again. She bragged that she had fixed what the man refused to fix, her voice filled with triumph. The trucks finally pulled away, their engines fading into the night, leaving behind a thick scar of cement where the creek once ran free. The man walked down and looked at the gray surface hardening under the moon. He crouched and touched it, his fingers tracing the rough edge. His wife stood beside him, her voice soft but certain. She said this act would not end here. She said Karen had just built her own ruin. The man nodded, standing tall again. He glanced at Karen's house where lights glowed brightly. Her shadow moved back and forth. Proud and blind to the danger she had created, the man returned to his porch, his phone full of recordings, his tower of violations growing taller inside, and now the creek itself, silenced for the first time in years, carried the weight of proof too. The night ended quiet. But beneath the silence something was building, unseen but certain, water pressing against the cement wall, patience turning into power, and as the man finally closed his eyes to rest, he knew the next storm would not just be weather, it would be judgment. And Karen would never see it coming. The morning after the cement job, the man stood at the edge of his yard staring at the creek that no longer sang. The water that once moved freely was blocked by a thick gray wall, the surface already cracking as the flow beneath pushed and twisted for escape. The birds that used to perch near the banks were gone. The air felt heavier without the gentle sound of running water. The man sighed softly. His wife came out holding 2 cups of tea, her eyes calm but serious. She whispered that nature does not forgive. He nodded, and together they watched the blocked stream. Later that day, Karen marched proudly down the street, her heels clicking like drums of victory. She stopped in front of the man's yard with her clipboard in hand. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Karen raised her chin and announced loudly that the nuisance had been dealt with, that the neighborhood was safe because of her leadership. The man asked quietly if she had considered where the water would go now. Her smile faltered for a second. Then she laughed loudly, mocking him for being paranoid. She said water could not hurt anyone if it had nowhere to run. She waved her hands at the cement wall as if it were a monument to her power. The man warned her again, his voice steady, that blocking a natural creek was like holding your breath. Eventually something must give. Karen rolled her eyes and scribbled more notes on her clipboard. She muttered that he should start packing because his fines were piling up and soon he would be forced out. She turned to the neighbors who were listening and bragged that the board had saved property values. Her voice rose louder, trying to drown the silence around her. But the silence felt heavy. Even the neighbors who usually nodded to her looked away. One woman whispered that it was not right. Another man shook his head and muttered that the creek had never hurt anyone before. Karen snapped at them to be grateful, then stormed back toward her house, still shouting about her authority. That evening the clouds rolled in, dark and slow. The sky turned gray and heavy. The man stood on his porch watching. The air smelled of rain. The trees bent with the wind. The first drops began to fall, soft at first, then harder, steady and cold. The cement wall held firm but the water pressed higher, crawling up the banks, spilling across the grass. The man calmly moved his tools and chairs to higher ground. His wife lit a lantern and watched with sharp eyes. Neighbors peeked from their doors, nervous murmurs spreading. Some remembered floods from years past. The old man down the street shook his head and whispered that the creek always found its way. But Karen stood at her window with her arms crossed, smiling as if nothing could touch her. The rain poured harder through the night. The blocked creek swelled like a balloon, the water dark and fast. Fish trapped beneath slammed against the cement wall, splashing, trying to break free. The man whispered to his wife that the storm was only beginning. She placed her hand on his arm and said patience, her voice steady. They both knew what Karen refused to see, that nature was building its answer, that the cement wall was not a victory but a ticking clock, and when it broke it would not knock politely, it would roar, and the first house in its path would be Karen's OWNBY. The 5th day the storm had grown heavy. Gray clouds hung low over the neighborhood and the sound of rain never stopped. The creek that once ran calmly at the edge of the man's property was now transformed into a restless body of water pressing hard against the cement wall Karen had ordered. Each drop added weight. Each hour the pressure built stronger. The man stood on his porch watching the current swirl angrily, his wife beside him with her arms folded, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She whispered that it was only a matter of time. He nodded silently. Neighbors peeked from their doors, uneasy, some with umbrellas in hand, some clutching children. The old man down the street shook his head and muttered that the creek was not meant to be stopped. Karen, however, strutted into the street wearing a bright raincoat, clipboard still clutched in her hands even as the rain soaked her hair. She shouted that everything was under control, that the water would settle, that her cement wall was strong enough to protect the neighborhood. Her voice echoed over the roar of rain but cracked at the edges. The man called out calmly and asked if she could not see how high the water had risen. It lapped dangerously close to the top of the cement, spilling little streams onto the grass. Karen laughed loudly, waving her hand, saying it was nothing, saying he was only trying to scare people. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances, their whispers rising. The husband carried another box inside the house, placing it on a table. Far from the floor, preparing quietly while Karen shouted louder. His wife closed the windows carefully, her movements precise. Outside the rain turned violent. Lightning split the sky. Thunder shook the roofs. The water surged harder, foam rising at the edges. Fish flailed against the cement wall, desperate to escape. Small branches and leaves gathered, clogging the flow even more. The creek was no longer a creek. It was a trapped river, swollen and angry. The man whispered that nature was patient but never merciful when disrespected. His wife agreed, saying that Karen had created her own punishment. They sat together in the dim light, listening to the rain hammer the roof. The neighbors gathered on their porches now, no longer hiding, watching the wall nervously, some with phones recording, others whispering prayers. The old man warned again that the water would not stay still. Karen shouted at him to shut up, her voice shrill and desperate. She insisted she was protecting them, that the HOA had saved the community, but her words rang hollow, drowned by the sound of rushing water. The rain showed no sign of stopping. Every minute the water rose higher, pressing harder, spilling across lawns, creeping toward the sidewalks. Karen's own yard was soggy now, puddles forming near her porch. She pretended not to notice, laughing too loudly, but her eyes darted nervously to the edge of her property where the water lapped closer and closer. The man stood again at his window. His wife placed her hand on his arm and whispered to wait, to let the storm do what it always does. He nodded slowly. Outside the cement wall groaned under the force, cracks beginning to show at its edges. Neighbors gasped and pointed. Karen shrieked at the workers she had hired, ordering them to fix it. But no one dared step into the raging water. The rain pounded harder, thunder rolled longer, and the creek, once peaceful, now roared with the voice of a beast, promising that its revenge was near. By the sixth day the storm showed no mercy. The rain came down in thick sheets that blurred the houses into shadows. The sound of water filled every corner of the neighborhood. The creek that once whispered calmly now roared like a beast trapped behind the cement wall. The man stood at his window, his face steady, his wife beside him holding a lantern, her eyes fixed on the rising flood. The water pushed higher and higher, dark and furious, carrying branches, mud, and broken pieces of wood. Every drop pressed against the barrier Karen had ordered, and with each hour the wall cracked deeper. Neighbors gathered under umbrellas, their voices tense. Some shouted that the water was too high, others begged Karen to do something. But Karen stood in her doorway with her clipboard clutched like a shield, shouting that everything was fine, her raincoat soaked through, her hair plastered to her forehead. She screamed that the HOA was in control, that there was no danger, but her voice trembled. Lightning split the sky and thunder followed so hard the ground shook. The water spilled over the cement, first in small streams, then in waves, rushing into lawns, flooding driveways, crawling toward houses. The man calmly carried another box upstairs, stacking it safely. His wife gathered blankets, moving silently. Neighbors began to panic. One woman cried that her garden was underwater. Another shouted that her shed was already ruined. The old man on the corner muttered that he had warned them all, that the creek always took back its path. Karen shrieked over the storm, calling the neighbors cowards, telling them to go inside, insisting her wall was strong. But as she shouted, a loud crack echoed through the night. The sound of cement breaking under impossible weight. Gasps erupted, people pointed. The man whispered to his wife that the end was coming. She nodded, her voice calm, saying Karen had brought this on herself. The water pushed harder, chunks of cement breaking off, the flow twisting and roaring as if nature itself was angry. Karen ran into the street screaming at the workers she had hired days before, demanding they fix it. But none of them returned. They had long vanished when the first cracks appeared. Now she was alone, soaked, trembling, her false authority crumbling like the wall she had built. The man opened his door and stepped onto the porch, rain soaking his shoulders. His wife followed holding her folder under a cover. Neighbors turned to watch them, phones raised high, recording every second. The man called out to Karen, telling her calmly that water cannot be trapped forever, that she should have listened. His voice carried steady through the storm. Karen screamed back that he was the cause of this, that he had cursed the neighborhood, her words wild, her eyes wide with fear. The neighbors no longer believed her. They shook their heads. Some shouted that she had destroyed the creek, that she had brought this disaster. The rain poured harder, the water rushed faster. The cement wall groaned like a dying beast. Another crack ripped across its surface, and the flood pushed against it with fury. The man turned back toward his house. His wife whispered that the storm was justice, and outside in the dark every neighbor knew the truth. The barrier would not last the night. And when it finally broke, the first house in its path would be Karen's OWNBY. The seventh night the storm reached its peak. The sky was a black curtain, ripped open by lightning. Thunder rolled so hard the windows shook. The creek behind the man's property had swollen into a raging monster, pressing and slamming against the cement wall Karen had built. Every crash of water sounded like a drum of war. The man stood on his porch watching with calm eyes, his wife beside him holding her folder close. Neighbors gathered under umbrellas and porches, their faces pale, their voices trembling. Some shouted prayers, some cursed Karen's name. But all eyes stayed fixed on the wall. The cement groaned louder with every surge. Deep cracks spidered across its face, pieces breaking off and vanishing into the churning water. The man whispered that the wall was dying. His wife nodded softly, saying nature never forgets. Across the street Karen stumbled out of her house, her raincoat hanging loose, her face wild with fear but her mouth still full of false power. She screamed at the neighbors to stop staring. She shouted that the wall was strong, that everything was fine. But her voice broke as another chunk of cement split away, sending a roar of water over the top, rushing across the grass toward her yard. Gasps rose from the crowd, children cried, mothers pulled them back. The old man on the corner shook his head and said he had warned them. Karen pointed at the couple's porch, screaming that it was their fault, that they had cursed the neighborhood, but no one believed her anymore. One neighbor shouted back that she had filled the creek. Another yelled that she had ignored every warning. Her power cracked louder than the thunder. The man stepped down from his porch, rain pouring down his face. He called out calmly that she had chosen this, that water cannot be commanded. His voice carried strong and steady. Karen's face twisted. She screamed that she would sue him, that she would destroy him. But her words drowned beneath the roar of water as the wall finally broke. A deafening crack echoed through the night, louder than thunder. The cement collapsed in chunks, and the creek exploded. Forward, freed and furious, waves surged down the blocked path, rushing straight into Karen's yard. Neighbors screamed and ran back. The flood carried branches, mud, fish, even pieces of cement, crashing into her porch, smashing through the basement windows with a sound like glass shattering in the sky. Her screams pierced through the rain as water gushed into her home, pouring faster than she could move. Neighbors watched in shock, some filming with trembling hands. The president of the HOA, now knee-deep in the very water she had tried to kill, her basement filling like a tank, fish swirling past her furniture, her screams mixing with thunder and the rush of the flood. The man stood silently, his wife at his side, both watching with steady eyes. He whispered that the creek had taken back its voice. She replied softly that it had chosen its first victim. The neighbors whispered too, some saying it was justice, others saying it was fate. But no one looked away. The wall was gone. The water was free, and Karen's kingdom was drowning before her very eyes. The storm did not slow. By the 8th day the sky poured without mercy. The broken wall lay in pieces scattered down the flooded creek. Water rushed wild and angry through the neighborhood, and Karen's house stood at the center of it all. Her basement windows had shattered under the force, and now the water gushed inside without pause. Furniture floated, boxes broke apart. Fish darted through the dark water as if mocking her pride. Neighbors gathered in clusters, some on porches, some in the street with umbrellas, their eyes wide with shock but also with something new, a hard anger that had been silent for years. They watched as Karen screamed orders no one followed, her voice high and sharp, demanding help, demanding respect, demanding obedience. But the neighbors did not move. They whispered to one another instead. One man shouted that she had done this to herself. Another woman yelled that the fines she gave them had ruined families. Voices rose louder, bolder, no longer afraid. Karen stumbled through her yard, her raincoat ripped, mud splashing up her legs. She shouted that she was the HOA president, that her word was law. But her words drowned under the roar of the water and the laughter that broke out among the people. Some clapped, others jeered. Phones recorded every second. The man stood calmly on his porch, his wife at his side. Her folder clutched close but her face calm as stone. She whispered that the board's paper crown was gone, and the neighbors were finally seeing the truth. Karen slipped and fell into a puddle, scrambling up, shrieking at the workers who had long vanished. She waved her clipboard high like a flag. but the papers inside were soaked. The ink bleeding away, useless. The man raised his voice just enough to carry through the storm. He told her that water always remembers, that she had tried to bury it, and now it had come for her. The neighbors cheered. Some nodding, some shouting their own curses at her. Years of anger spilling out like the flood itself. Karen turned on them, calling them traitors, fools, but no one listened. Her own board members stood behind her in silence, their faces pale, their eyes ashamed. One by one they stepped back into the crowd, abandoning her. The water rose higher, pouring deeper into her basement. The glow of lamps flickered then died. The house groaned under the weight. The sound of rushing water filling every corner. Karen screamed again. A scream not of power but of fear. Her kingdom was drowning and no one would save it. The wife stepped down from the porch, her calm presence silencing the crowd. She said in steady words that this was what came of pride and lies, that the creek was never an enemy, only a mirror, showing Karen her own reflection, broken and wild. The neighbors listened, their faces lit with a mix of awe and relief. Someone clapped again, louder. Then others joined until the storm carried their voices with the thunder. Karen covered her ears, her shouts lost, her house sinking into chaos. The man took his wife's hand and led her back inside. Their shadows calm against the lantern glow. Outside the neighborhood watched the president who once ruled them all fall lower with every drop of water. The flood did not stop, and neither did the whispers of freedom rising like a second storm through every home on the street. By the ninth night the storm had not eased. The creek had ripped itself free of every barrier and poured through the neighborhood with a voice too loud to ignore. Karen's house groaned under the weight of it. Her basement now a dark pool where couches floated like rafts and fish darted between broken lamps. Neighbors gathered in the street despite the rain. Their umbrellas tilted, their phones held high. No one hid anymore. They wanted to witness the fall of the woman who had ruled them with fear. Karen stumbled out onto her porch, her face pale, her hair plastered to her cheeks. She screamed at them that this was sabotage, that the new neighbor had cursed them all. Her voice cracked but she kept shouting, clutching her soaked clipboard as if it could save her. The man stood on his porch across the creek, his arms folded, his wife beside him with her folder, calm and silent. Karen pointed at them wildly, demanding the crowd see her as a victim. But the neighbors did not move toward her, they shouted back instead. One man yelled that she had fined him for painting his shutters the wrong shade. Another woman screamed that she had been forced to sell her home because of false fees. Voices rose one after another, anger boiling over years of silence. Karen backed up, shaking her head, shouting at them to stop, insisting she had protected them. But no one believed her anymore. The water surged again, a wave smashing against her porch, splintering the wood. Her knees buckled and she fell. The neighbors gasped then laughed bitterly, not with joy but with release. The spell of fear had broken. Her board members, once loyal shadows, stood behind the crowd now, their clipboards gone, their eyes downcast. None of them moved to help her. She saw their betrayal and shrieked, calling them cowards, but her words were drowned by the roar of water crashing into her basement again. The man stepped forward, his voice steady over the chaos. He told the neighbors that nature had revealed the truth, that Karen's power was built on paper and lies, and paper drowns fast when the flood rises. His wife added softly that this was not the end but the beginning, that from now on no one should live under threats. The neighbors cheered, clapping and shouting. Some wept openly, some hugged each other. The sound carried louder than the storm. Karen covered her ears, her soaked clipboard slipping from her grip and vanishing into the flood. Her symbol of control swallowed in the same water she had tried to silence. Her eyes went wide with shock. She screamed at the creek as if it were a living enemy, but her voice was lost. The neighbors turned their backs on her, walking toward the man and his wife, their faces lit with gratitude and relief. Karen's house stood trembling, the basement fully drowned, the windows glowing faintly under the water like an aquarium no one had asked for. Fish swimming past the outlines of furniture, her home a twisted monument to pride and downfall. The man placed a hand on his wife's shoulder and whispered that the storm had chosen its lesson well. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the broken queen of the HOA, knowing the final blow was coming soon. The neighborhood was no longer hers. It never had been. It belonged to the people who had lived in fear too long and had finally found their voices in the roar of the creek. By the 10th day the storm clouds finally began to drift, but the damage had already been done. The creek had torn free of every chain, rushing wild through its natural path, and Karen's house stood ruined at the center of it. All, Her basement no longer looked like a living space but like a glass tank. Water pressed against the windows from the inside. Fish swam past her ruined furniture. Chairs floated. Boxes bobbed against the ceiling beams. It looked less like a home and more like an aquarium built by her own pride. Neighbors stood openly in the street now, no longer hiding behind curtains. They pointed, whispered, laughed bitterly. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others raised their phones higher, capturing. Every second, Karen stood on her porch in soaked clothes, her face pale with defeat but still shouting, screaming that it wasn't her fault, that the new neighbor had tricked everyone. Her voice cracked, hoarse, broken. She waved her arms wildly but no one moved toward her. The board members who once stood at her side now avoided her eyes. Some had already walked away quietly, blending into the crowd. One of them muttered that they wanted no part of this anymore. The neighbors shouted back at Karen now, louder than ever, their anger years in the making. One man shouted that she had ruined him with fines that never existed. Another woman cried that her family had been bullied until they moved away. Voices rose until Karen's shouts were drowned under them. She tried to scream about rules and power but her words fell flat. The water spoke louder, gushing from her broken basement windows in great bursts, carrying books, rugs, even pieces of her staircase into the street, her home. Cracked and groaned, a monument collapsing, the man stepped forward onto his porch. His wife beside him with her folder still dry, still safe, her eyes calm and steady. The man raised his voice just enough to carry over the crowd. He said this was the end of fear. That no one should bow to threats written on paper when truth flowed as strong as water. The wife opened her folder and held up the documents once again. Proof of ownership, proof of rights, proof that Karen had no power to change the earth or the law. The neighbors cheered, clapping, some weeping with relief. Their voices filled the stormy air like thunder. Karen dropped to her knees, her hands clutching the porch rail, her eyes wide with shock as she realized no one believed her anymore. Her kingdom was gone, her voice worthless, her house drowning behind her. The man and his wife walked down from their porch slowly, calm, steady. The neighbors parted for them, letting them stand in the middle of the street. The wife spoke clearly, saying that from this day on the HOA no longer ruled by fear, that the people had the power to stand together. Her words echoed and the neighbors shouted back their agreement. Karen screamed once more, calling them fools, traitors, but her words fell into silence as the water in her house rose high enough to snuff out every light. The crowd turned away from her, leaving her alone with the aquarium she had built, her house glowing faintly with water and fish like a cruel joke written by nature itself. The storm finally slowed, the rain easing, the clouds drifting, the creek flowing free once more, calm again but carrying the memory of what had happened. The neighbors hugged each other, smiling with relief, some promising to help rebuild, some swearing never to let fear rule them again. The man and his wife returned to their porch, sitting side by side, their hands joined, the folder resting safely on the table. They watched the creek run smooth once more, the sound of water, gentle but strong, the sound of truth. The sound that had broken the false crown of a woman who thought she could own what could never be owned. The HOA's reign had ended not with papers or threats, but with water, and the street at last belonged to the people who lived on it, free.